and then joined sometime in 2000. So I wanted to do some history for a bit to kind of give you the context about the UUA's Article 2 and where we are now. I think it's always good to start from where we were and get ourselves to where we are before we figure out where we're going to go. So I just thought I would kind of journey through, not all the way from the beginning of Unitarianism and Universalism. That will take more than an hour. But more around, starting around the consolidation of Unitarianism and Universalism that led to the formation of the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961, which is where the story, at least about Article 2, begins, because that's when the new bylaws that were created, when the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America consolidated in May 1961 to form the UUA. In order to understand what the UUA is as a religious organization and who we are as a religion, I want to lift up something that I'm sure many of you have encountered, which is talking to people who are unfamiliar with Unitarian Universalism and being asked, so what is it that you believe? And you're trying to figure out a way to answer that question, or being asked questions like, so do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you read the Bible? I'm sure many of you, or maybe all of you, have encountered those questions in some way or form. And then you try to explain, and in conversations that I've had to sometimes say that, no, we don't have a set of beliefs. No, we don't have a creed. And so people ask me, so if you don't have a common set of beliefs, so what is it that you all believe? What holds you together? And my response has been, we are not a belief-centered religion, we are a value-centered religion. And usually after that, I have pulled out the 7 principles, usually that little card that I would carry around, because I don't memorize the 7 principles, because they're not a creed, and so I'm not required to memorize them, even if I'm a minister. And so I then share the 7 principles that, talk about the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process, the goal of world community with justice, liberty for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And of course, people then say, wow, those are interesting, nice principles. I can relate to those. And I have had to clarify that these principles are not our beliefs. They're not confessions of faith. They're actually ethical principles that we as congregations covenant to affirm and promote. So these are not that we as individuals covenant to affirm and promote, though we could as individuals consider them as our beliefs. And this is how we choose to be in community together, that these principles serve as our guides to living here and now, and living with each other, and living in our wider community, in our nation, and in our planet. And that our principles are aspirational, that they are really hard, challenging to live them in practice, and that we regularly miss the mark. And so we keep trying, that we fall out of covenant on a regular basis. But the purpose of our covenant is to bring us back into relationship together so we can continue the work of living into these principles. And that is what we try to do in our congregational lives week after week, that it is an ongoing invitation for us to understand, explore, and live our principles. And therefore, our principles and purposes inhabit a prominent place in our lives and as part of our faith, and also on paper. Now, these principles and purposes, along with the 6 sources of our living tradition, and I will go into them in a little bit, are written into the Article 2 of the Unitarian Universalist Association's bylaws. Now, I've always wanted to do a forum on bylaws, so I'm getting my wish after all these years. So I'm just personally thrilled. So the UUA's bylaws, Article 1, gives us the name, the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. And then it offers one sentence about the UUA's history, that it is the successor organization to the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America. That is Article 1. Article 2, which comes next, is entitled Principles and Purposes. And it is one of the C bylaws, alphabet C, dating to the consolidation of the AUA and the Universalist Church of America in 1961. Now, much of the C bylaws, and there are quite a few things in that section, reflect compromises that were made in order to achieve consolidation. There are different pieces of the C bylaws that were so important to one side or to the other that these were made harder to amend the C bylaws. And the wording of the original statement that came about first in 1960 and then finally adopted in 1961 after the consolidation had been the matter of such rancor and debate that it nearly derailed the merger at the time, that they had to really work and find so many compromises. And there was a lot of contention around whether to include such phrases as love to God and love to man, and a reference to our Judeo-Christian heritage. And so a compromise version, including a critical change from our heritage to the heritage, was finally hammered out by the committee in an all-day, all-night parliamentary negotiation and debate at the General Assembly. All day, all night, people were engaged in heated debate, and finally, it was adopted. Now, I'm just going to give you a glimpse of what those original principles said. That's right, Gwen. It was very bureaucratic of us to try to define our theology in only like 2 pages in a set of legal bylaws. But, given that Unitarian Universalists, one of the sacred texts of Unitarian Universalists is Robert's Rules of Order, it should not surprise us that we chose to take this route to include some spiritual wording in the midst of all this legalese. Anyway, let me pull up share screen and show you the original bylaws. I'm sorry, the original statement of purpose. Is everyone able to see?
Yep.
All right. In accordance with these corporate purposes, the members of the UUA dedicated to the principles of a free faith unite in seeking to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship. To cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. To affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. To implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace. To serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion. And number 6, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. There you have it. So, thus, those were our principles up until 1984, when the first major rewrite of the original principles happened, brought about in large part by women who came together at a women's conference. There used to be the UU Women's Federation that met every year in retreat. And they were studying the principles that were in existence then and really found that they could not really connect, relate, or resonate with quite a few of them, including the very sexist language that existed in those principles then. So they started a movement to have the UUA board begin the process of revising the principles. And it was not easy. It was challenging to get that process started, but it took a few years and then it began. And then the UUA board appointed the Article 2 Commission, and they went through a process and then rewrote the principles and purposes, which were then first adopted in 1984 with a simple majority, and then were adopted in 1985, where they were required to have a 2/3 majority, but not only were they adopted nearly unanimously in 1985, but they have lasted virtually unchanged for almost 40 years. So which brings us to our current principles and purposes, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which I read earlier. And I will just quickly go through not the 7 principles, but also the sources. So the section C21 has 2 parts: the principles, which are the 7 principles, and then the 6 sources. which are the direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, which is the first source, words and deeds of prophetic people, wisdom from the world's religions, Jewish and Christian teachings, humanist teachings, and spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. So these were the 7 principles and 6 sources, which initially were just 5 sources. And then in 1995, we added the earth-centered tradition source as the 6th source that were adopted. And then there are other parts of Article 2, which include the purposes, which is the UUA devoting its resources to and exercising its corporate powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. And the primary purpose being serving the needs of member congregations, organize new and extend and strengthen UU institutions. And then section 2.3 is about inclusion, which talks about our commitment to being an anti-racist, anti-oppressive religious community. And C4 is about freedom of belief. So these principles and purposes guide our actions and our priorities, encouraging us to affirm and promote our core values, while our sources provide the context and grounding for those purposes and principles. Now, for some religious institutions, the equivalent of Article 2 would be regarded as a permanent statement of belief. But ours is a living tradition, and so we commit ourselves to regularly revisiting our principles and purposes to ensure that they are relevant. Because for us, revelation is continuous. Revelation is not sealed, not in any book, nor in any bylaws. And so we grow in our understanding, and as we evolve, our principles and purposes grow and evolve too. And since new occasions teach new duties, we must continually examine our principles and purposes to see what is missing, what is no longer important, and whether the language communicates our core values to the current times. So, to that end, in the spring of 2020, the UUA Board of Trustees created the Article 2 Study Commission and charged it to review the Article 2 of the UUA bylaws and propose any revisions that will enable our UUA, our member congregations, and our covenanted communities to be a relevant and powerful force for spiritual and moral growth, healing, and justice. End of quote. Now, that's just the first sentence of the charge. The full charge is actually much longer, totaling 900 words, which I'm not going to repeat. As you know, we UUs will say something in 200 words, even if it can be said in 2 words. That is part of our living tradition, and we are proud of it. Anyway, this particular charge emerged after 2 years of dialogue and debate that happened at the 2018 and 2019 General Assemblies, and also after specific attempts to revise the principles going back more than a decade, including an effort to more clearly articulate the worth and dignity of non-human life, and including the movement to establish an 8th principle that calls us to conduct our congregational life and build beloved community in anti-racist, anti-oppressive ways, which I'm sure you are familiar with, since we went through this process and adopted the 8th principle at Cedar Lane. And so 10 years ago at the Salt Lake General Assembly, there was an attempt to revise the current UUA principles and purposes, but it failed to get a 2/3 majority. So that effort failed at that point. So this is the new process that once again was initiated. Anyway, the commission has now completed its work, and it published its proposed new Article 2 this past fall. And the proposed Article 2 is quite different from the current Article 2. First of all, the proposal does not list any principles. Second, the proposal does not list any sources of our living tradition. Instead, the proposed new Article 2 names 7 values at the heart of our covenant. Love is the central value, or as the proposal reads, the enduring force that holds us together. And then as we read further, it says, love inspires and powers the passion with which we embody our values, which include justice, generosity, transformation, pluralism, equity, and interdependence. And it accompanies a nice visual, which let me pull up. You see that there is love at the center, and then you have justice, evolution, which has now been modified to transformation, and that's interesting, isn't it? Pluralism, generosity, and equity. I want to pause here to show you a quick video that the commission did about the changes that are being proposed. Rather than go through it, I will just share this with you, and then we can have a dialogue. And now I can't find that video. There we go.
The Unitarian Universalist Association will devote its resources to and use its organizational powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. Its primary purposes are to assist congregations in their vital ministries, support and train leaders, both lay and professional, to foster lifelong faith formation, to heal historic injustices, and to advance our Unitarian Universalist values in the world. The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love.
Section C 2.2. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared value. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are justice, pluralism, interdependence, transformation, generosity, equity. On the screen now, you see a diagram, and it is an image of a chalice with an overlay of the word love over the flame, with 6 outstretched arms that create a circle around each of the core values and form a 6-petal flower shape. Each arm is a different color, and they are interdependence, orange, equity, red, transformation, purple, pluralism, dark blue, generosity, teal, and justice, yellow.
Interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. We covenant to cherish Earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. With humility and reverence, we acknowledge our place in the great web of life, and we work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect.
Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect.
Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities.
Section C23, Inspirations. As Unitarian Universalists, we use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us live into our values. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which they were created and are currently practiced. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. Grateful for the religious ancestries we inherit and the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom.
Section C24, Inclusion. Systems of power, privilege, and oppression have traditionally created barriers for persons and groups with particular identities, ages, abilities, and histories. We pledge to replace such barriers with ever-widening circles of solidarity and mutual respect. We strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcome all persons who share our values. We commit to being an association of congregations that empowers and enhances everyone's participation, especially those with historically marginalized identities.
Section C 2.5, Freedom of Belief. Congregational freedom and the individual's right to conscience are central to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed.
Hi, everybody. My name is Satya Mamdani, and I am a member.
So the process by which this proposal needs to go through in order to be adopted is actually quite simple. The UUA board first reviews and can amend the proposal, which they did in January. And then in June, at the UUA General Assembly, which will be meeting in Pittsburgh, the delegates will have the opportunity to amend the board's version and then take a simple vote to accept or reject it. And I mean, it needs a simple majority. And then if accepted, there will be a year of further study. And then there will be some more final edits, and then a final vote will take place at the 2024 General Assembly. And at that point, it will need a 2/3 majority to be adopted as the new Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. So, thoughts, questions, comments? Gwen posted in the chat, the UUWF, the UU Women's Federation, is still around and celebrating their 60th anniversary this year. That's right, Gwen. And she writes, the new Article 2 principles are different in form more than in content to me. Vicky.
I have to admit, I am confused. I do want to understand better what we are substituting this, which seems perfectly acceptable to me, for what, which doesn't go as far.
So, so these are being proposed in place of our current 7 principles and 6 sources, Vicky.
Okay, okay.
And
it's a more articulated version of
that's right.
what we believe and what we adhere to. Is that right?
Yes, yes. And also has some new things like that whole section on generosity is new. That was not there in our current or previous principles and purposes. The 8th principle also has been included in this. So it's kind of been added to the current value, this proposed values. And so it's no longer a separate principle as was articulated as the 8th principle.
And so what will happen to our 7th and or 8th principles in the process of doing this, accepting this?
In the process of accepting or adopting these, those will cease to function. So they will no longer be part of the UUA bylaws and all, and they will then be replaced by this draft that we just saw. So Shira had her hand up, and then Gwen.
Yeah, okay. A lot of the 8th principle language has been incorporated, but really not all of it. There is one part of the 8th principle that I think is especially important, and that's the part where they talk about acting accountably to dismantle oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. But my concern is the part that says dismantle oppressions in ourselves. And I don't see that anywhere in this version. And I think it could go under the values section, under transformation. I think that's especially important because, you know, what we've been talking about becoming multicultural and multiracial, anti-racist, this is not new. This is something, it seems like maybe roughly every 50 years or so, there's a big blow up about something very racist that happened. And everyone says, oh, we need to do something about this. And people talk about it. But my perception is that most people talk a lot about it, but they don't look into themselves to change themselves. And so it just seems like a vicious cycle that people keep talking about it, but they don't, for various reasons, they don't do the work to become the change they want to see.
Right.
And that's really the only way the congregation, any congregation, is going to change. Because if everyone's talking about what, if everyone's talking about what's wrong and what others are doing wrong, and they don't work to change themselves, where's the change?
Right.
And there really historically has been no change, but there's been a lot of effort, a lot of talking about it.
Right.
So
Shira,
I feel
actually,
very strongly that has to be in the new Article 2.
yes. So Shira, to respond, it is actually in the new proposed language under the section in justice, where it talks about we work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all people thrive. It goes on to say we covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of oppression within individuals and our institutions. We are accountable to each other for this work. So
Oh, okay.
they did include
Thank you, but
that.
I
Yeah.
think would be important to change
Sure.
the say accountable as individuals. I think it'd be a
Right.
good idea
So
to
Shira,
change that to
Shira,
ourselves.
we're not going to be discussing amendments to the language in this. You know,
Okay.
this is
Yeah.
more trying to inform ourselves and try to get an understanding. So it's a point you're raising that I think, you know, you may want to convey that to the commission because they will be considering amendments or changes at the General Assembly. So, and there is a process for that. That might be a way to go about this. But I want to
Okay.
get to the others, Gwen and then Jack.
I'm in a new place now, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I think one thing that's really, really important for us to remember is these are not personal belief instructions. These are about our congregations and how our congregations are going to work together, how the UUA is going to work with our congregations, how we're going to be as communities together. And I think like we don't need we don't need as much about our interpersonal in our bylaws. This is a legal document for the state of Massachusetts. We can do so much outside of this process to say what we want to do and how we want to be deeper. But we need a 2/3 vote to pass this. And so we need to say what we need to say in a way that is like understandable and big enough for a large group of people to feel included, while also like incorporating a lot of different pieces. Lots of people like Paula Cole-Jones and other people from the Article 2 process were very, very involved in this, in everything it took to get here. Like people who worked very hard on the 8th principle for many years are largely, like a lot of them are largely happy with this language. So I think we can, as individual congregations, as individual people, keep working on other ways to make the language about accountability, the language about internal oppression, part of what we do. But I don't think that it actually, I don't want to make it any harder to pass this than it is. I want this to pass. I think it's 90% good enough. I think we'll have some follow-up pieces in the year that comes up. There are some places in which we've made love a little too defining and not left quite enough space for theists. And there's some places where we've made, you know, the word a could replace the word the, and more people would feel included. But I think that will happen later on. I really want us to change the language of democracy to be about democratic process for the purpose of justice, because the current structure of our principles doesn't account for the fact that lots of people use democracy to stall justice. So I think it's like that this document has really taken a huge amount of feedback and created something that we can move forward on. And like, I also think it's important that like the principles and the sources will leave the legal bylaws. They will become part of our history. I cannot imagine that people will then say, if you believe in them for your personal belief definition, you can't use that anymore. That's not how that's going to work. We're just saying that, like, I think what we're really saying is this becomes part of our history. And some sermon, we might have a sermon that's like, we used to define inherent worth with these words. And then we started to use these words. And here's another reading that I think that connects to it in a different way. It's just going to become part of, it's not just because I think for some people the principles are more important than they are to me, but they will become a maintained part of our history. So
Thank
thanks.
you, Glenn. That's a really good way to frame it and invite us to, you know, what I heard you talk about is what it means to be part of a living tradition, and how we choose to flow through our story, which is constantly unfolding, and we try to be present in the moment while recognizing and honoring the past, but not necessarily seeking to live the past. So that's a good way to kind of look at what is being considered. Jack, and then Susan.
Yeah, I found this to be very helpful. I have a somewhat more resistant to the change. I don't know whether it's the New Hampshire conservative in me or not, but when I read the part of the objectives where that it serves as a personal code of ethics, evangelical, a way to explain to others who we are and draw their interest, in rhetorical, I don't see it. To me, the principles, the 7 principles augmented by the 8th principle, are very clear. I find them very personally meaningful, and it doesn't take very long, as you've noted, to explain who what are our values. And I find the values are very clearly indicated there, and I don't need a lot of verbs to have that happen. So I'm a little resistant to making a change unless there's some really important advantage to doing so. And frankly, I don't see it. I think what we do in terms of our actions, not we say that we're a place where love works, but show it. Be more active, be more visible in the world. I don't think, this reads like a long essay instead of a short explanation of who we are in a code by which we can live.
Thank you, Jack. Susan?
I was interested in, I believe it was section 2.4, talking about the, did it refer to the congregations having freedom to, I lost part of that. Does this give the congregations more freedom to act on their own so that every UU church will not necessarily be exactly alike in their with principles on the front door, but if we wanted them, we could still use them in any way. I'm not wording this well. I guess my question is, what is 2.4 about? And is it when was she referring to the idea that individual congregations will be more empowered?
It's actually 2.5.
It's 2.5, Susan. Yes, so that actually goes to, that's one of our really ancient spiritual principles, which is enshrined in our congregational polity, and goes back to our heritage, both on the Unitarian and the Universalist side, where congregations have the ultimate authority and are freely formed and have the authority and the right to organize themselves freely as they deem fit, and organized around a covenant and not a creed, which is the freedom of belief clause, which again is a spiritual principle for us, which is what it is. That section, it says, nothing herein shall be deemed to infringe upon the individual freedom of belief which is inherent in the UU heritages, or to conflict with any statement of purpose, covenant, or bond of union used by any congregation, unless such is used as a creedal test. In expressing our beliefs, we do so in the spirit of love, in ways that further beloved community. And that's something that has existed. It was part of the original bylaws, the Article 2 purposes, and then it is in our current purposes, and it is carried forward into the proposed version.
I have one other comment.
Yes.
I really like what Jack said about the 7 principles, and it is the first time you read them, it's such a joy to read them. But then the second or third time you read them and start getting more critical, you think there's a lot of redundancy there. There's a lot of tripping over your own tongue. And then we add the 8th principle, which I think was too wordy and not direct enough. If we're moving into the future and we want people to join us and understand who we are, we have to speak and show ourselves in the language that is modern and acceptable and easy to grasp quickly, and then you can go into it more deeply. So at the first time I saw this diagram, I thought, what is it, a cartoon? My religion's got to be more than a cartoon. But then you look at it and you see how each one of those flowers around love is backed up with a very good explanation that makes sense and is clear. So I will always cherish the 7 principles, and that's why I joined Unitarian Universalism. But I kind of like the idea of updating the language and clarifying it.
Thank you. I want to go to Marilyn and then Gwen.
Well, I don't have a copy of that to look at right here now. So it's a little hard. The 6 areas just seem vague to me. And I'm wondering if you're talking to someone new and you want them to want to come here, they're coming from some other religion probably, or none. And I'm not sure, it just seems very vague to me, and I don't know how it would give anyone much of a basis. I kind of am with Jack on this.
So Jack, I appreciate that principles have always mattered a lot to you, and they don't mean anything to me in a spiritual way. And I realize that that's really hard for a lot of people to know that that's the reality for some of us. They mean a lot in what maybe it means to behave. Thank you, Kathleen, who says that they're leaving now in the chat. I learned the principles as a middle schooler, and they didn't give me a lot of emotional or action access to the religion. And I think that anything we spend decades with as part of how we define ourselves is really important and means a lot to us. And like, I totally get that everybody has a different experience of it. I feel like I put this in the chat for those people who have access to it. I know some people can't see it. The report has created one short sentence to go with each value. And I think for a lot of people that will end up being accessible in the same way that the principles were one short sentence for each principle. But what I think I like about this, and a lot of other people like about this, is that they're framed as value, behavior, actions, not beliefs. And I think the principles are challenging to sometimes implement because they're framed as principles and not actions. I also personally just feel like it was really important that we went through this process where we talked to like hundreds of people. And I really I want it to succeed so that everyone who engaged in this process gets to feel like part of that, what they did mattered. And that like all of the ways in which we said the 8th principle is so important that we are not just going to live it up to congregations for years and years. We're going to move it into all of the different pieces of what we do. So I like that it feels more actionable, and it feels important, and it also feels nonsensical because there are bigger fights in the world that I'd like us to move on to. But it's like, we got so far, I just want to be done. I just want it to succeed. But I don't want to like deny the fact that yes, from like that there are people who aren't like me for whom like those individual words are etched in your memory in a way that is really important.
Vicky?
Yeah, so I may not be able to articulate this in the way I want to, but as a lifelong UU, I started out as a Unitarian, Universalist rather, and then when I was about 11, became a UU. I just feel like there's so much overthinking about some issues within our church, within our faith. And I feel like this is one of them, that like there's this open heart that we have as UUs, that we don't have to fight these little tiny battles, that we can be bigger than the little tiny battles. And I wish I could say more. I wish I could explain myself more, but that was what my lifelong immersion in UU was about, was you don't have to fight these little tiny battles. You have to look at the bigger picture and what is important. And sometimes this conversation is veering into those little tiny battles. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know whether I've been able to articulate it in any articulated way, but I just feel like there's just something inherent in all of us that we just need to have faith in and promote and go forward with, and not be so critical about, or we can be critical, but we can also be embracing. So that is my comment.
Vicky, spoken like a true universalist. I love it. I mean, that was a beautiful articulation of universalist theology there.
Oh, thank you.
And reminded me of the quote that is misattributed to Francis David, but it's a beautiful quote, which is, "You need not think alike to love alike."
I love that. That's
Yeah.
good. Mhm.
Thank you. I see any other comments, thoughts? All right. Well, thank you. You've been such a wonderful group, and really enjoyed your thoughtful responses and your really listening to this process and this beautiful tradition that, what brought me into this faith is this process, the way in which we engage and try to be present in real ways and apply what we espouse in how we live our lives. And to me, the articulation, while important, is not the end all in how it comes out. It's more the way in which we seek to be true to those and go about it as a covenanted religious community. And I think our time together and this conversation embodied that beautifully. I hope and wish that this is the kind of discourse that happens at General Assembly. Right, Gwen? Wouldn't that be something?
That'll be great. I think General Assembly will be really good. It will be harder.
All right. Well, thank you again. And we shall encounter each other as we go along and have more conversations. There will be an orientation for those who are going to be delegates at our General Assembly. We are creating something with our Potomac partners in June. We'll be sending out information to all of you who are planning to attend and participate as delegates at the General Assembly. So please stay tuned for more details.
And there if you haven't registered for GA yet, there are several amendment workshops that are coming up in May. I don't know whether we need our delegate credentials in order to enter those. Do you know, Abby?
I don't. That's a good question. When we'll look into it. The board is going to be formally approving the delegates at the board meeting next week. So that will clear the path for those of you who are planning to be delegates, and then you'll be able to then start attending to any business that begins. So,
All right.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Much.
You,
Good night.
Thank you.
good night.